Mondays with Mike is a podcast by two friends from the Seattle area. Originally intended as a news analysis podcast, as of spring 2025, it has lately mostly covered current events. Show notes can be found at mondayswithmike.ddns.net. Mondays with Mike is your weekly helping of opinion and critical analysis of the day's news. Bud asks the questions, and Mike supplies the takes. Start a social revolution. Make friends with your neighbor. Disagree without being disagreeable. And remember, if it's Mondays, it's with Mike. Alright, so this week we saw on Wednesday the biggest spike in the stock market ever, which would be good news, I guess, were it not for the fact that the stock market was all over the place, mostly way down, for the remainder of the week. And I'm just looking online now. It was up on Friday, and it ended the week slightly above where it began the week. But in any case, we haven't seen a week of volatility like this, and volatility essentially on every single day, like we did this week, in a long time, if ever. Trump often says, "You've never seen anything like it." In this case, you really had not ever seen anything like it in terms of the volatility, not in my memory anyway. This was caused by, initially, there were going to be huge tariffs on tens of nations, maybe even a majority of nations. And then he, on Wednesday, said that those were on pause for 90 days. So mark your calendar for the first week of July. A great July 4th thing to look forward to. But they're still on for China. And as a result, we are not out of this volatility woods yet, I would say. Do you think I've characterized the events of the week fairly?
Yeah, for the most part, the tariffs are still on at the 10% level, so those are still in effect. Also, a handful of other tariffs are still in effect, so some of the stuff on aluminum and steel, and some of the the pause only refers to those reciprocal tariffs, what they're calling them, the ones that are in response to the existing tariffs, plus the ones on that chart that he had in his press conference, so the non-trade barriers and the tariffs. What's happening is that there's just a baseline of that 10%, which is still significantly higher. But yeah, no, you're characterizing what happened is pretty accurate of this huge volatility and unpredictable nature of the market. I think what struck me was that it was so broad and sweeping. We haven't seen anything quite on this level with a policy declaration since, I would say, World War II. Even every single country on the planet's affected by the declaration, because this is going back to Smoot-Hawley. That was in the 1930s, a long time, almost 100 years, that you've had tariffs placed to such a degree, in such a sweeping manner, and affecting so many products, because usually tariffs are targeted. They're targeted to specific industries or specific products, but these tariffs are sweeping on almost every product that's traded. So yeah, that's what struck me when I saw this. But yeah, for the most part, you're right. Just that the pause is it's a little misleading that the tariffs are actually paused. They're not. There are still tariffs in effect. It's just that the higher rates and the variable rates, where some countries got significantly higher, aren't in effect for everyone but China. China, on the other hand, has 145%. So
Yeah. Previously existing tariffs remain in effect. The 10% tariff, in addition, that Trump put in for all nations, in effect. The things like it was going to be maybe 80-90% for Vietnam, different rates for every country, those are paused. So, more to come on that. Now, he characterizes the tariffs as having to do with the reciprocal countries' tariffs, including non-monetary tariffs against the United States, and to that he would add VAT taxes, which I haven't heard portrayed as tariffs before. But the formula for determining the tariffs that are on pause would have more to do, it just seems at first blush, to have more to do with our trade deficit with that country than the purported tariffs and non-monetary tariffs and VAT taxes that is portrayed. It seems to me, therefore, to just be a disconnect between how the information appears to be and what official sources are saying. They're not in the same world. They have it would have to do with similar concerns, but the information is just inaccurate. Am I tracking right here?
No, so it's accurate in the sense that they're looking at the trade deficit and they're taking the total percentage of trade deficit and just dividing it in half and then slapping that on as a tariff. And if you look at the formula, it looks at our total trade deficit with a country, divides it in half, slaps it on as a tariff. So if we are importing significantly more products from a place than they are importing from us, then we slapped a higher tariff on the places we are importing more from. And that's pretty much the formula. The issue with the formula is that it doesn't reflect the reality of what tariffs actually were from these countries and places, because there was a tariff regime from the World Trade Organization that has pretty structured tariffs that were agreed to of very small percentages on products that in no way reflect the reality of what they were saying in their formula, because some of these countries were slapped with just massive tariffs like Lesotho and Vietnam and Cambodia and a few other places that are just wildly higher than the volume of trade that we were doing with these places compared to other places. And the issue that I found with the algorithm and the formula that they're using, we're effectively punishing poorer countries because they're not having the exact same amount of trade as what we buy from them. We are the largest economy in the world. There's no way that if they have something we want and we have something they want, if they don't have the GDP or the existing capital to make the expenditures, we can buy a ton of stuff from them and they just have no feasible way of having the same exact trade with us. It just doesn't happen, right? Because it's the people within the country buying the stuff, right? Businesses and importers. It's usually not countries making those massive purchases. And so it's a completely nonsensical formula that they slapped onto all these countries. If you look at the actual details of the math that happened, that they literally just took whatever the degree of difference is between how much we buy from them versus how much they buy from us. It effectively punishes the poorest countries and developing markets that haven't had enough industrialization, enough specialization, enough money, period. And it also flies in the face of what being a consumer looks like, right? If you have money and you have the resources to buy things like the US does, we buy things, right? We buy computers, we buy furniture, we buy planes, we buy really expensive things. Other countries might not necessarily buy the same things we do, and yet we're punishing them because they don't buy things from us. So, say for instance, you're a landlocked country like Lesotho. Are you going to go around buying a battleship or a space shuttle, or are you going to go around?
No, they have no need of a navy. Yeah.
Are you going to go around buying submarines and like all sorts of things that the U.S. buys because we've got two oceans? No. And so it's completely nonsensical to punish countries for the fact that they don't buy very high capital expenditures that get tariff. Sure, we're going to have a trade deficit with them if we're buying up all their like wool and bananas and stuff that they're creating that maybe they're creating that we want, because we're a huge country that has lots of consumers that want stuff and will pay a premium for stuff that gets imported. Looks like it's just designed to punish countries that are poor.
It's if you buy something, presumably you're buying it because you want it or because you have use for it. I can't make a Snickers bar, so sometimes when I see a Snickers bar, if it's $1.50, what's that to me? Like the Snickers bar, please. And so if the other countries are producing things that are of use to American citizens and American industry, then, but those countries say they're developing economies, or say they're poor, or they're landlocked, or maybe we don't make things that they want, in any such case, if they don't then buy an equivalent amount from us, then we charge them. But what they did was they provided something which we wanted, which somebody in America wanted. So would the idea be that we should be producing that here? Because there's comparative advantage in economics, where it's presumed, like we have a lot of farmland here, so we're pretty good at producing wheat, and we have a lot of technology, so we're pretty good at producing tractors and planes, and there are a lot of things that we're good at producing, but we're not going to be good at producing everything, and not everybody would have the money to buy our products. So they get punished for not having the money to buy our products, despite that they're providing something that somebody in America wants. Seems weird.
It is. So that's my gripe with this whole thing from the start, is that the way that they're looking at tariffs in the world is completely not, in some ways it's very nonsensical, because there's this assumption built in that somehow it's the countries that are paying for that was their initial spin. I remember the press secretary was saying that tariffs are a tax cut on consumers. Tariffs are import duties paid when importers have to clear their products from a port of entry. So if someone gets products in from a plane or a train or a boat, right, at a port, wherever the product arrives, they have to pay a fee essentially to the country that the products are arriving to. And so there's no way that's a tax that those countries are paying. It's a tax cut for consumers. No, it's essentially the cost of doing business, which is why you're going to see, if these tariffs on China aren't lifted, just a significant number of bankruptcies on the horizon of companies that have either their entire supply chain or most of their supply chain in China. Because if you've made a huge purchase of products, say 100,000, 50,000, whatever, and you've already made the purchase and they're in transit, you either have to store those products somewhere and wait for the tariff to go down, or you have to pay an eye-watering amount of money to get the products out of the port so you could get revenue and sell. And I was watching a CNN interview where a guy was saying that he was expecting to pay 30,000. He's figured that he would have to pay around 100,000 to 150,000, somewhere in that range, for something. So if you had planned a certain amount of money that you had to pay, and that amount of money just tripled or doubled, whatever the amount, it really is going to hit these small businesses hard, because small businesses are the ones that comprise, I think it was 40, I was looking at the numbers, it's 42% or something of all imports from China were small businesses. So it's small businesses trying to get a product and then sell it somewhere else. And that's a huge deal. If someone's an entrepreneur and they've got a company where they've leveraged with credit or loans, or they're trying to grow their business by selling their product in retail stores or expand operations, we don't necessarily have the scale for production of little knickknacks, like toys or certain kinds of glass, or all the different things that they have factories for in China. The US doesn't have that kind of infrastructure for scale at that level. And so maybe there's an end goal in sight in a year or 2 years or 3 years of changing or affecting change to economic policy in China, but I'm not holding my breath that they're actually going to comply, that China might just say no. Because we need, right now, since we do have a trade surplus with China where we import way more than China imports from us, it's about trade-offs. I was thinking about this a lot. If all these businesses in the US rely for their employees and for profits and revenue on imports from China, and they don't have a meaningful alternative, that wave of bankruptcies is going to hit the US pretty hard by a loss of tax revenue, a decline in our GDP and economic growth when there's a huge wave of unemployment. Because it's not just the companies that will go under; it's also the all the things that rely on those companies. So their supply chains, any creditor. There's a whole list of cascading effects that happen when the economy has a shock like this of a fifth of the economy just disappearing overnight. Because if trade effectively stops between the U.S. and China because of these eye-wateringly high tariffs, is 145%. There are ramifications. Trade isn't just like we give you money, we get something in return. A lot of these companies, they had price agreements and they had contracts that they were supposed to fulfill. If they don't fulfill them, terrible things happen. But one thing I was researching is something called a foreign trade zone. So there's an option for companies to bring their products in and not pay a tariff in the US for a period of time. So what they can do is they could pay for their products right in China, and if they have approval for a free trade zone, that's going to be prime real estate for however long this tariff thing happens for whoever has the permissions. Because what they can do is park all their stuff if they don't have to bring it to market immediately in these foreign trade zones and just sit on it until the situation improves.
Are those going to be in the United States?
They are. So there's hundreds of them all over the U.S. of areas that are set aside ports and outside major cities. There's a whole bunch in Washington. I was looking at the list, but they're all over the U.S.
Can I move to one of them and get cheap prices on foreign goods?
No, so I was thinking about that there may be creative ways people are going to try to get around this. One of those is the foreign trade zones, where what you do is you can bring the products in, and so long as you don't actually try to bring them into the U.S. to sell them, you don't pay a duty in that zone. So it's like in the U.S., but you can't actually put it on the market. So what people do, or what they did in the past, is you'd bring in all the raw materials into a foreign trade zone, and then you would only make the end product, and so you'd only get tariff on the one end product instead of the whole supply chain. But the issue with the current tariffs that are in place is that they're pretty much on all products for the 10% one. But where this would be really useful is stuff like aluminum and steel or other products where there's like extra tariffs on top. But no, so that was one thing I was thinking of. The other is something like trade, like an outlet store or whatever, or trade market outside of the economic zones in the ocean or in space. The tariffs are only paid in a port of entry in a country's sovereign territory, right? So when you bring the product into the US. So I'm thinking, so there's got to be some loophole or exception, because the US doesn't own the world, right? It doesn't control the oceans, it doesn't control space. So there's got to be some kind of exception where essentially you're not paying a tariff. So because you only pay a tariff when you actually bring a product into the economic exclusion zone of a country, into their port of entry where they collect it. That's the customs duty. So there's got to be some creative exemption someone has with terra nullius, which is land that no one owns, or the middle of the ocean, or space, where you have effectively products can be exchanged there that no one can tariff because no one owns the oceans. And so that might happen. But that would require some creative innovation on the parts of businesses and trade partners. And I'm not so sure that, because everybody would have to be on board with that concept. What might also happen is that everybody just excludes the US, right? Not everybody, but the major economies circumvent the US and ignore us. And sure, they like our market and they need our market, but we're not the whole world economy, right? That there are places to sell that stuff that don't require the US.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how, so if there was a small country and they exported $1 billion worth of stuff to the U.S., and they had no particular need to import stuff from the U.S., but then they would get a huge tariff on what they were going to import. So then they could look for cheap things that the U.S. sells to try to offset it, like maybe food, but I don't know that they would want to do that, because they would get U.S. dollars, because I was thinking if they were selling to us, they would get U.S. dollars, so they would be able to pay for the goods, but they probably would prefer to buy other things from other countries for the US dollars. They would prefer not to buy from us. But if they would buy some sort of percentage of stuff from us, the more they bought, the more competitive their goods would be in the US. So only one country in the world could really play this game, because a country is not going to be able to structure their trade around multiple countries doing this thing. Okay, but in any case, those are on pause. But not for China. Do you want to talk about China, or do you want to add something to my sort of rambling of if I was the trade minister of a small country? So they're still on for China.
What's next on the plate if the tariffs keep staying in effect and the Trump administration doesn't negotiate some kind of deal is there's a handful of things in the toolkit that are definitely going to be devastating if they start delisting companies from operating in China at all. If they stop U.S. movies from premiering in China, that's a big thing. If they stop their tourists from traveling to the U.S. and boycotting the U.S. entirely, that's a huge amount of money lost in the U.S. market. Because I was looking at what are the countries that travel to the U.S. for tourism, and the answer is Canada is a lot. It's 20 million, Mexico, and then China's on the list, and a couple of and a bunch of countries from Europe. And if you look at the numbers right now for tourism, they're down across the board of people traveling to the U.S. from Canada because Canada's annoyed with the U.S. about this annexation talk and the tariffs. It's down a quarter tourists from Mexico in terms of air travel. People from Mexico don't want to travel to the U.S. right now for a variety of reasons. I'm sure this is one of the tariffs thing is one of them, but the other issue is this whole ongoing saga with the tourists being detained and locked up for any kind of mistake instead of just being turned back at the border. They had that there was that Canadian tourist who she had some issue with her work visa, and so they locked her up for 12 days instead of just letting her go home and resolving it there. And it was like, okay. So Brand America, I was thinking a lot about this. Brand America right now is having some trouble because it's not just tariffs aren't just like an economic tool. They also affect goodwill towards the United States. And so where this became really apparent, and I think it's the reason Trump paused the tariffs, is that do you remember that Zelensky meeting with Trump where Trump was going, you don't have the cards, you don't have the cards, you don't have the cards?
Who could forget that?
Right now, the US does not have the cards if other countries in the world really wanted to put the squeeze on the US in sense that Trump is trying to reimagine and reorient the entire global trade system with the huge sweeping tariffs, et cetera, completely ignoring existing trade agreements and other stuff that we have with countries where we might have free trade or no tariffs or any number of other things that were hammered out over time. But what he doesn't have is much wiggle room for the debt and the interest on the debt.
Oh, yes, thank you, yes.
When the stock market was going down, the bond market yields were going up. Wait a second, that should have been happening. People should have been running to the bond markets to safeguard their money as a safe haven because that's what people do, right? If they think that there's volatility, they go to what they think is a safe asset. Bonds, treasury bonds. And treasury bonds are how the US spends its money because we have huge debt. Anytime they raise the debt ceiling, all that means is that they can issue more treasury bonds that the government then sells to people in return for operating expenses, right? That they promise to give them money at a later date. How bonds are a whole complicated thing. But the whole issue, and I was really carefully looking at what is going on. Like, why did Trump get so skittish so fast? And apparently, the Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, in his first few weeks, went on a bit of a world tour to some countries around the world that have huge amounts of treasury bonds. So he went to Japan. He went to closed door meetings in Europe. And it seems that there may have been an argument made that the way you get the US to listen is that you affect the bond market. And the way you do that is you just dump huge amounts of bonds quietly or all at once that dramatically raises the supply of bonds, right? Without the existing demand. Because if you raise the supply but people are selling, then the demand doesn't match, and that's why the yield rates go up because there's more supply of bonds than there is. The whole point is that if you do that, it makes it more expensive for the United States to pay the interest on the debt.
because if the price goes down, then the yield goes up. And if the yield goes up, that is to say the interest rate goes up, and if the interest rate goes up, then the amount of money we have to pay on the national debt goes up, and we do not have terribly much wiggle room on that. It's not that we got none, but we do not have terribly much. So this actually, for a long time, people would say, China holds our debt. What if they sell it?
If you want to talk about something that would, have you ever heard of the term Pyrrhic victory? Right? That
Yes,
you
of
win
course.
something, but at such great cost that you're really losing. That's how I'm looking at what's going on right now. That the whole economic system is built on trust and goodwill. And if I sell you something, I expect that you sell me something of equal quality and consistency so that we're getting a fair trade. If I sell you an orange, I expect the orange not to be rotten. And if you sell me a banana, I expect the banana to be edible. It's the whole notion of trust and credibility, etc. Trump's volatility of just like wildly applying, this goes back to that trade deficit thing of wildly applying completely variable rates on countries means that there's very little consistency. There's no rhyme to the reason of being able to understand how you can adequately operate in the market. If you don't understand that, then everybody's, wait a second, if we can't trust you on this, that you're going to honor agreements we made that were hammered out over long periods of time, free trade agreements and previous tariff agreements. If you're just going to do it suddenly without warning, then the issue becomes a matter of credibility for the US dollar and the bond markets. Like, when we come to collect, will you pay up? Is the question.
Really quick, one of the complaints against FDR, retrospectively, and probably in the moment, during the Great Depression, was that all kinds of new regulations were being imposed on the economy, and they were new to it, so they seemed arbitrary, and they might not have been uniformly applied. And people said, opponents of FDR, and most people like really loved FDR in terms of consistently popular presidents. He was pretty darn consistently popular. But those opponents of his were like, it's important for an economy to function on predictability, because because you have to make decisions months, maybe years in advance. So if you don't have predictability, you can't do business. So if we don't have, so you could make a conservative argument against Trump. You can't do business without predictability, and that's why there's such stock market volatility. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
You're right. The predictability is the point. I think that countries talk to each other in all sorts of ways. Usually it's diplomatic. They call each other up. Hey, how's it going? What's going on? But they also talk in this way. So because the US has a weak point, obviously, of this huge national debt that depends on the bond markets, and other countries are allowed to purchase up those treasury bonds, Canada bought up 350 billion worth of treasury bonds. Japan has 1.1 trillion. China has, yeah, in the neighborhood of, I think it was 800 billion. The whole point is that those three countries alone control about 25% or so of the foreign held debt, and they all got slapped with tariffs. And countries don't like getting slapped with tariffs if they've had existing agreements or they depend on each other. It just seems mean, right? That was essentially the message from China, that the U.S. is being a bully in the world economic system. And they don't want to play. But the whole point I'm making is that there is an existing national security risk, and this is a failure of both parties to not actually pay down the debt. Clinton had a surplus and had a whole plan. He had a whole like thing at the end of his administration. We're going to pay it down. We've got the money. We found a way. We're going to do it. And then Bush comes in office like, nah, here, have a huge tax cut.
I remember I remember Fox News, when I was a little boy, Fox News reported that W had said, we're giving a tax cut because that money belongs to the American people. And I couldn't formulate it at the time, but it stuck in my head, and I realized so does the debt.
And as I get older and wiser, and my college degree in political science, right? Debt is what it really is, the ability of a country to operate. We see this every time there's a debt ceiling crisis in the U.S. because they won't just fix it or solve it, right? That we have this sort of like arbitrary thing where Congress has to say, "Yep, you can keep getting money." If the U.S. dollar stops being the reserve currency, we will see just ridiculous outcomes of it becoming very expensive to operate in the world. Obviously, we want people to buy up the debt, but allowing foreign countries to have so much leverage over the US economic system and in that same sense the global economic system means that these kinds of sweeping economic changes that Trump tried to do have a clearly a real wall, right? Because they sent a not so subtle signal to the Trump administration. If you do this, if you really go through with these massive, sweeping, across the board tariffs that will radically reorient the world economic system, it doesn't matter if you think it's fair or unfair. We think it affects us in a terrible way. So our only way to make you listen is to say we hold the cards, because that this is going back to that Zelensky meeting. You don't hold the cards. You don't hold the cards. The U.S. does not currently hold the cards in this situation unless they did something ridiculous, right? That thing Obama talked about of issuing $1 trillion coins and then just depositing them in the treasury, right? That could happen, and that would be a way to stop these kinds of shenanigans. But the trade-offs become really unreal, right? We either pay off the debt immediately by issuing just exorbitant amounts of money really fast, completely destroying the value of the dollar with hyperinflation, or countries can use the leverage they have, which they have because they own so many bonds, of just altering the yield rates and making it more expensive for us to operate, which means that the options become politically untenable for Trump of either tax increases on the rich, so no more tax cuts that he's trying to do, or some other way of raising revenue. In terms of raising revenue, the thing that just happened was they opened up the national forest for logging.
Oh God.
If you saw that in the news, where I think it was 3 billion pounds of board are being cut every year, and the current limit is about 6 billion, but they just weren't doing it because there's not enough mills and loggers in the country to reach that capacity in terms of the amount of wood cut in the country. The U.S. right now doesn't have enough mills that are working and enough lumberjacks to cut down the sheer volume of wood that they're even allowing to be cut right now. Maybe some innovative or intrepid person's going to figure out a way to capitalize on it. But the whole point is that the Trump administration just significantly increased the amount of forest that can be cut down in the national parks from where it was before. That just happened.
Yeah, that's pretty depressing. One thing, so it sounds like they tried to wage an economic conflict and did not realize they didn't hold the cards. That we're playing with Great Depression too. They're playing with Great Depression too. Yeah, so we would need to spend less in order to weather such a storm, and we would also want to put more of our debt on longer term, on like 30-year treasuries, as opposed to short-term treasuries, if they were selling them, or if we thought they were selling them. But I don't see financial discipline in the U.S.'s future, frankly. And I will honestly say from either party. Like, especially from the party who's always, let's give a tax cut now. No, we should have stopped that. We shouldn't have done that. We shouldn't have done that in the aughts. Probably shouldn't do it now. That is my opinion.
I'll say this much: it's very strange to both whine about the debt and the deficit, and also impose huge, sweeping multi-trillion-dollar tax cuts. It's completely irresponsible, frankly, to say that we need more revenue, but the way we get to more revenue is by cutting revenue dramatically. And also, in terms of talking about which party gets more revenue or brings in more taxes, etc., the Democrats are much more effective at this because they actually want to fully fund the IRS. They don't want to fire anyone. They want to improve our collection capacity. If you look at right now, they're doing cuts to IRS such that it's going to make it more difficult to give people money who need money, and also to collect money from the people who have money. And the collect money from people who have money part of the process is really important, right? Because if you don't actually collect the taxes from the people who owe the taxes, you're not getting the taxes. I mean, there was that prediction that came out from the IRS that the cuts alone that the US is making, they think they're going to be down $500 billion in revenue in this current tax season because they don't have enough money to and resources to audit all the very wealthy people in the country. Okay, so then what do? You find that money somewhere else?
Expanding the tax base seems like the only way, to me at least. And to do that, you need more jobs. It seems to just need to be jobs. It seems like the only way to me.
I don't know that they've priced in the huge tax decrease that's going to happen when all these businesses all of a sudden go belly up and can't pay their employees and can't they don't make any money, because remember, the tariff is just one tax that businesses pay. That's just the money that they're paying to get their product to market. They also pay taxes on payroll and social security if they have employees. They also pay taxes when they make money by selling the product. So tariffs effectively are a double tax. If there's any taxes on there's taxes on the front end, right, to get the product to market, then there's taxes on the back end when you sell the product and market. I don't think they've priced in just how much money we're going to lose in tax revenue if all the tourists decide to stop showing up because we're messing with their livelihoods and or the livelihoods of their countries or the stability of the economic system. Do you remember we were talking about the sort of intangibles, the goodwill, feelings economy?
Now, that I do not quite recall.
The point I was trying to make is I'm worried about, I think I called it immaterial, the non-material goods, right? So the stuff that countries trade with us or give to us that aren't physical products. And so in the big one is tourism, right? Is tourism and foreign students going to US universities and paying 2 or 3 times the amount of tuition that domestic students pay.
Oh, that's right. Now I remember. Yes.
It's the intangibles. It's people spend money that reflects their values, right? And so we're seeing this play out right now with the huge decline in Canadian tourism, the huge decline of air travel. But that's not the only thing going on that's affecting Brand America. The revoking of those student visas, that's a huge issue because it's going to create a chilling effect for students wanting to study in the US. And since the bread and butter for so many of these universities in order to operate is those foreign students, who knows how much tax revenue they're going to lose from just the sheer amount of volume of lost income from less tourists. Because remember, tourists spend way more money. There was a guy on a show in CBC for Canada. He broke it down that Canadian tourists bought way more stuff and spent way more money on food than Americans do in certain markets. Like they spent collectively way more money than all the McDonald's.
We're talking markets in America?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're on the road. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
because they show up, right? They're tourists, and tourists spend more money seeing the attractions, buying the souvenirs. They show up and they go to hotels, right? And
Yeah.
they go to restaurants and buy fast food, and they go to theme parties. The list goes on and on. If you look at the world tourism in terms of total amounts of revenue, the United States is number one in the world for the amount of tourists that visit it every year and the amount of, at least in the amount of money that is spent in the US for tourism. And so a 10% decline in that, a 20% decline, a 30% decline, that's huge. And so I think the argument that I keep hearing from the Trump administration, and it's an argument, I don't think it's a very good argument, but it's an argument that, oh, we need these eye-wateringly high tariffs to reshore American industries and bring manufacturing back to the US. Okay, but the trade-off there, and they're not being honest about this, is that we're going to really annoy the world. And if you really annoy the world, and they are our customer in terms of tourism, there is a serious risk of huge amounts of money not only being lost from the tariffs that were imposed on China because they form a huge percentage of our economy, but also the huge loss in tourism. And that's where you get something like a Great Depression or a recession, is when a policy has unintended consequences or ancillary effects. And that's where you get a cascading failure because If you look at the deal with tourism, why it's so important is you can't offshore tourism, right? It's an industry where people show up and spend money in your country, right? We're not exporting our tourism around the world, but other countries send their tourists here. Right now, this 145% tariff on China and the current situation between China and the US means that upwards of a million Chinese tourists just aren't going to show up in the US. I don't see it. Why would they? I don't think American tourists are going to be able to. Maybe they'll go to China, but not in the degrees they were. But then this issue with Canada is that Canada is our number one group of people that travel to the US for tourism. 20 million tourists a year. If you do the math on that, that's billions of dollars. There's actively a boycott from Canada and Canadian consumers over that annexation stuff. That's not even related to tariffs. It's really short sighted to only focus on the physical material products when so much of the US economy isn't that. It's tourism, it's services. I think Amazon and streaming services and Facebook and internet and all that stuff that isn't a physical product, but that relies on other countries liking us enough to buy what we're selling them. If they stop liking us enough because of the guy that was elected into office and the things that he's doing, that affects brand America. And that's really tough to regain if other countries offer better opportunities for tourists to travel to.
Bumpy ride for 2025.
It's still,
Yeah.
yes, it still is a bumpy ride for 2025.
Yes. This exciting discussion continues next week on Mondays with Mike. We'll see you next week here on Mondays with Mike.